So now what we want to take a look at is the footer element. The footer element is similar to the header element in the sense that it can be used for individual containers. So it's not necessarily the footer for the entire document, but rather the container that the footer is being placed inside of. So the description on the W3C's website reads like this. The footer element represents a footer for its nearest ancestor, sectioning content, or sectioning root element. Now, sectioning content or sectioning root element really gets into something called the HTML5 outline algorithm, which we're not going to discuss in great detail in this course, but essentially sectioning content simply means a container element like the elements we looked at over the course of this chapter, or a sectioning root, which would be considered something like the body element. It continues to read, a footer typically contains information about its section, such as who wrote it, links to related documents, copyright data, and things along those lines. You can also use a footer element to contain an entire section if those sections represent things like indexes, long license agreements, things along those lines. One thing that I'll note is you need to be somewhat cautious if you're going to be using a footer to mention who wrote a particular article. If you're going to be talking about information about the author, generally there's different types of elements within the HTML5 specification which could be considered more appropriate. A good example would be something like the address element. If you're going to put contact information about the author or the editor, that really should be in an address element, not necessarily a footer all by itself. So just keep things like that in mind. With that being said, if we take a look at the completed example, we definitely have a footer here. So we want to come back into Dreamweaver and we want to add that footer to this HTML structure. Of course, we want to place all of this within this div wrapper element. So we can go ahead and make sure that we have a blinking cursor after the article element and before the closing div tag. That's the case right now here in the code view. I'm going to come over to the split view so you can see how this gets inserted both in the code and in the design view. You want to come over and click the footer button here in the structure section of the insert panel. When you do, we have to give it an ID, which I'm going to give it an ID of footer. Then you can go ahead and click OK, and you'll notice that the footer has been added. Again, we're using the footer as a closing element for the entire page, which is completely appropriate. So we're pretty much complete here with our HTML structure. Of course, what we want to talk about a little bit is the significance of the div element, and then we want to start adding some content to this page.